Lads and lassies, Falcher out there. Ed Harrington is my name, and we're here tonight for a very special lecture, the Leo Swan Memorial. Just before I move any further, please you just switch off your mobile phones. To give a mention to this month, it's available in the Camera Shopping Square. This one has Anne's name on it, but it could just as easily be yours over the Camera Shop. It might make an idea of a gift for someone for Christmas. Each year in December we remember a man who did so much for Tallaght. Leo Swan, teacher, archaeologist, aerial photographer, lover of history, and of course founding member of the Tallaght Historical Society. Once again, I would like to thank his wife Verity for joining us. We are privileged to have with us tonight a leading authority on our maritime history, and this gentleman and the lecturer would greatly please Leo, I know. Cormac Loud spent several years at sea. Some people say he's still at sea. On merchant ships, and has been a diver for many years. He has served on the Council of the Maritime Institute of Ireland and the Old Dublin Society. He's also a member of the Irish Maritime Archaeological Society and the Historical Diving Society. Cormac has written numerous articles over the years for a variety of historical magazines and journals, and tonight we welcome him to give a talk on Ireland's underwater architectural heritage. Cormac is a great guy, he's a good friend, a great neighbour, and we've had the privilege of having him lecture us here before. So without further ado, Cormac, take it away.
Thank you, Chairman, and good evening, Winnie usually. First of all, just let me say that I'm deeply honoured to have been asked to give the annual Leo Swan Memorial Lecture to the Tallaght Historical Society. I've had a great pleasure and privilege in the past of attending lectures that were given by Leo Swan of an archaeological nature. Leo was a wonderful person, as Ken pointed out. He was a teacher, head teacher in the school here in Tallaght. He was an archaeologist and a historian, and he was also a pilot, flyer, and he was the first in Ireland, as far as I know, to use aerial photography as a tool in identifying ancient archaeological sites. As I say, I had the great privilege and pleasure of attending lectures on an archaeological course that I was on, that he gave. But I'd have to recount to you one story that he told us, which stuck in my mind. I thought it was absolutely very poignant. He said that he was excavating at the site of an old monastic site that had been closed down during after the Act of Suppression during the time of Henry VIII. And he said that there was a large flagstone across where the door of the church had been, and they decided to lift it. And what did he find underneath it? Only a very large iron key. And he interpreted that as being that the last man out turned the key in the lock and put the key under the flagstone. And he said he was very deeply touched by that. I'm sure many of you have very, very fond memories of him, because he inculcated a love of heritage and tradition, historical matter, in the children with whom he dealt. And indeed he got them to collect stuff for a small museum that was on view here in the library at one stage, and got them to write down various tales of folklore and history that they'd heard. Now, underwater archaeology as such came of age in about the 1940s with the invention by these two gentlemen here, Jacques Cousteau and Émile Gagnon, who was an engineer. Cousteau would be known to most people as a great diver. With the invention of that apparatus that's hanging on the wall there, the aqualung, combined with a cylinder of compressed air, gave freedom of movement underwater, untethered to the surface. And Cousteau was one of the very first people to realise that it would be a great archaeological tool for underwater archaeology. Historical wreck sites were literally torn asunder and pillaged over the next decades, particularly the Mediterranean. But I had some correspondence with Cousteau before he passed away, and this is a signed photograph that he sent me not long before he passed away. Now that's Cousteau's first underwater team. and they were nearly all ex-French Navy personnel. But when Cousteau was actually given a present of his famous ship, the Calypso, by one of the Guinness family, a man called Lowell Guinness gave it to him for something like £1 a year of a peppercorn rent. He leased it to him. But one of the very first projects that Cousteau ever did on an underwater base was here in a place called Le Grand Conglou, which is a little rocky island off Marseille. It was known that there was some antiquities down at the bottom of that, and rather than do a sort of a hit and miss job on it, they actually spent 3 whole seasons excavating the wreck down. It was quite deep, and that's very typical there of what you'll see on Mediterranean shipwrecks, because these are called amphora, earthenware containers that have been described as the jerry cans of antiquity. They literally carried everything in those over several thousand years around the Mediterranean. All sorts of food and oil, stuff like that, were carried in them. So they actually spent 3 seasons doing that. Now, the very first shipwreck that was ever discovered in Ireland with the advent of scuba diving equipment was that one on the top there called the Cuellar. That was rediscovered in about 1955 by some of the first Irish divers when diving equipment became generally available. It was quite scarce in Ireland at first, but it was a great opportunity missed, because the Cuellar was a great big brand spanking new Ireland clipper ship that was on its maiden voyage from Liverpool out to the colonies in Australia during the gold rush. There were a huge amount of passengers on board and literally hundreds of tons of cargo of all of the artefacts and appurtenances of everyday life, stuff like you see here. And like a great many more shipwrecks around the world at that period, it was literally torn asunder and plundered. When I say torn asunder, I mean physically torn asunder, sometimes by attaching trawlers to it and ripping pieces of it out to get at some of the cargo that was there. There was never a great representative sample or samples of any of the artefacts that were aboard gathered up and conserved properly. Now, there are literally attics full of this sort of stuff out in North County Dublin, but none of it has ever been undergone proper conservation. These are some pieces that are in the Maritime Museum, but it was an opportunity lost. And I have to confess that I've dived on it myself and removed a few broken bits of crockery. By the time I dived on it, all the good stuff was gone. But nevertheless, as I say, it was an opportunity lost, and it was the very first wreck ever discovered. A good friend of mine passed away recently, Jerry Bourne, found the bell of it, and in his will he donated it to the National Museum. And as far as I know, it's hanging in the foyer in Collins Barracks. That is the builder's half model there. I got a loan of it at one time from the person who had it in his possession. I won't say the owner, because there's a story there. But I got a loan of it, and I partially restored it, and I took the lines of the vessel from it. At least we know what the ship looked like now. That's the half model that was used in the building of the ship, by taking it asunder layer by layer. And it's the method of getting the lines of practically all vessels up to quite recently when computers took over. So when the person who had it died, he left it to me in his will, and I did a full restoration on it, and I donated it to the Maritime Museum, where it'll be going on view shortly with the rest of the artefacts from the Cuellar. So that was the Cuellar in 1854. It simply went up on Long Bay in a gale. Should have been heading down the Irish Sea, heading for Australia, and instead it was heading to its doom across the Irish Sea. But I took the lines off the model and in the Maritime Museum. Now, prior to the invention of the aqualung, there was some archaeological work done using that sort of diving equipment there. That's called hard hat or standard dress copper helmet diving. Used for, throughout the 19th century for doing work and salvage work principally. But this man here was a Benedictine monk called Dom Odo Nundle. And in the last decades of the 19th and the first ones of the 20th century, he did a lot of work in excavating and examining crannogs, particularly in Scotland. Did a huge amount of work in Scotland. He was a great historian also. So he actually carted some of that gear around the Highlands of Scotland, around various lakes, examining crannogs. That's the pump, the air pump that was used in connection with that. You have to have two guys turning that all the time while you're on the bottom, otherwise you'd run out of air. So he used, I think, a pony and cart, and carted the stuff around the Highlands generally. That sort of equipment was made by a firm called C.B. Gorman. Now, C.B. Gorman are still in existence making medical equipment. But the man who invented, it was literally the man who invented that kind of copper helmet and all of the things that go with it, the pump and all. And he was in business with his son-in-law, William Gorman, who was an Irishman. His name was William O'Gorman, and he changed it to Gorman for some reason. He was married to Seal's daughter, and they went into business together. He was a retired sea captain. But another man who was involved very early on in the 19th century in archaeological diving was this man, Thomas Steele, who was the right-hand man of Daniel O'Connor. He's there on the left of the picture. But that's he was involved with O'Connell in the repeal movement, in the Catholic Association first of all, and the repeal movement. But he was forever at O'Connell's side. But he was an engineer and an inventor of underwater apparatus. I was amazed to find. But in 1835, he got involved with a crowd called the Dean brothers, who were the very first to use this copper diving helmet that had been invented by C.B. But they really co-invented it with C.B. Gorman. And C.B. Gorman manufactured it. And they were diving on the wreck of the Royal George, a great big warship off Portsmouth, when they came across the wreck of the Mary Rose, which was very nearby, and they excavated some of the guns. And Thomas Steele, O'Connell's sidekick, dived with them for a season on the wreck of the Mary Rose when it was first discovered. These are Mary Rose guns that were discovered at that time. As you know, it was rediscovered in 1982. But there wasn't a great deal, as I said, of underwater archaeology as such. People literally had no way of getting below the surface. But there were various finds associated with water, with rivers and lakes and crannogs, and to a limited extent the sea. This is a great big dugout canoe that's in the National Museum called the Lurgan Longbows. That was found in a place in Galway that had been a lake, and it had just literally silted up, would dry out. These were dwellings, man-made dwellings mostly, in the middle of lakes that were built for protection, normally by putting down a causeway and laying down a platform of rocks and trees. When the lakes would dry out, there was some archaeological work done. There was quite a lot done in Lough Cuellar and Limerick over the decades. But there was also a lot of finds made in water. And it's a known fact that these were not just casual finds, casual losses. They weren't just lost in water. They were generally associated with ritual deposition, offerings to the gods or offerings to ancestors, bronze swords, spears and bronze axe heads, even stone axe heads. It goes back further in time. Nobody really knows why these things were placed in water, because they would have been very valuable objects in their own right during that period, probably as an offering to the gods or in memory of revered ancestors. You can see loads of this sort of stuff in our museums. Now, prior to 1987, when new legislation came into being, practically all finds underwater, particularly in the sea, were governed by what was known as the salvage aspects of the Merchant Shipping Act. Now they were framed in the furtherance of maritime commerce, to reward people for finding, say, cargoes of ships that had been lost or ships that were being wrecked, to reward people who had made an effort in order to salvage such matters. And if anybody found an archaeological object in the sea, they could claim it or claim a reward or claim ownership of it under the salvage aspects of the Merchant Shipping Act without taking any account whatsoever of its archaeological value or context. That all changed in 1987 when it was seen that there was a dire need, and I'll tell you why just in a moment now. There was a dire need for a change in the legislation when finds were beginning to be made, not only on land, or not only underwater, but also on land. It was groundbreaking legislation, the National Monuments Amendment Act in 1987. It vested ownership of all shipwrecks over 100 years old in the state. You require permission to dive on them or to examine them or do anything with them or to excavate them in any way. But it also provides for a discretionary award. If you hand up something, you report something or hand it up that you find underwater or even on land. Now, two schools of thought with regard to discretionary awards. One which says they should be low to discourage you from looking for objects, and the other one which says that they should be fairly high to encourage people to hand stuff up. So I think the situation in reality falls somewhere between those two things. But what I'm going to do now, before we move on to Ireland proper, I'm going to tell you about some of the major archaeological underwater finds that were made in various other countries in the world in the past couple of centuries. Now, this is a beautiful painting by Wright of Derby, wonderful artist, of a little lake in the Alban Hills near Rome called Lake Nemi. Now, during the reign of Caligula, he was a Roman emperor who had a very, very short reign from 47 to 41 AD. He was a notorious spendthrift and a very obnoxious type of person generally, and he succeeded in spending every penny in the imperial treasury. During his term of office, he had two enormous ships built to float on that little lake that I showed you as floating palaces. Now, the two of them put together would probably fill most of a football pitch. And the amazing thing about it is that from the time of Caligula up to the time they were rediscovered or salvaged, as I'll show you now in a moment, knowledge of the ships being in the lake was never lost. It was always known that they were there. That's Lake Nemi there. It's only about 1 kilometre across, by 1.5 kilometres long. And it's a beautiful place. I've been up around there and it's a gorgeous, enchanting sort of place. Always has been. There was some diving done on these wrecks back in the Renaissance period by a man called De Lorena on behalf of a knight called De Marchi in 1535, and various objects were recovered. But coming up to the end of the 19th century, an enterprising gentleman called Eliseo Borgi got a hold of a load of the CB Gorman type diving equipment and started to plunder the wrecks and take stuff up off them. And he had a sort of a museum with a load of artefacts in it. Now, I gave a very extensive lecture about this, and you can read a paper that I wrote about it online with a lot more illustrations on it. But there's some beautiful artefacts on board the vessels. Now, when the fascists came to power under Mussolini, old Mussolini rather regarded himself as a modern day Roman emperor, and he was fascinated by anything to do with ancient Rome. And it was decided during his reign, during the fascisti reign, that the ships would be taken up out of the lake and conserved. So an end was put to all diving on it, and the stuff that had been brought up by the man I showed you there in the diving camp, but that was all seized by the Department of Education in Italy, and it was decided to drain the lake rather than try and lift the ships out of the lake. They decided to pump the lake dry and get the ships out of it. Now, that's just one of the ships there. Now, various upper works have been dragged off them over the years, but they were absolutely enormous, and they were made in the very same way as Roman warships at the time, using the very same methods of construction, the same materials, except that they were bigger than any Roman warship that ever existed. In fact, they were the biggest ships in the world until right up into the 19th century. I'll just show you a little bit of, this is when the lake had been largely pumped out. It became a great national campaign, I suppose, a great patriotic campaign to get this job done, and everybody rode in and donated all sorts of gear. Pumps, the pumping firm did all the work for nothing, and people supplied all kinds of material. It was decided to build a new museum on the side of the lake to house the ships. And over a period of about 4 years, both of the ships were taken out of the lake and housed in this museum here. And literally an army of people had descended on them to do the conservation work and get everything ready. And it became, I suppose, a hugely popular venue. That's the museum there, still in existence. That's the great big pumping situation there, pumping out the lake. It took about 1.5 years to pump the lake low enough to get the ships uncovered. But these are just some of the artefacts that were found. Look, beautiful bronze decorative animal motifs that were on the ends of the beams that held the side decks. It's not known what these ships were for. It was generally thought to be a floating palace, one of them. And the other one was thought to be a temple to the various deities that were worshipped around the lake, notably that of Diana, the huntress. That's a coloured photograph of the time. The ships were actually sheathed with lead, in the same way that ships were sheathed with copper in later centuries, held on with bronze nails, and there would have been tarred felt underneath that. There were also all kinds of marble palaces on board, and a lot of the stuff had fallen down into the ships, and a lot of that was recovered. That's a picture there of the museum getting ready to go. Now, during the Second World War, the Germans were retreating up northwards, up Italy, after the Allies had invaded, and they were attempting to hold a line from roughly about Rome eastwards across Italy through the Alban Hills. And there was an SS anti-aircraft unit stationed near the museum, and they were being bombarded by an American artillery unit, so they decided to pack up and leave. And shortly after they left, smoke was seen coming from the museum, and in no time at all, everything in the museum was burned to ashes. Not a solitary trace of the ship was left, because the ships had been treated with tar, with archangel tar, and various other kinds of creosote and stuff like that, which was very inflammable. And there's not a trace of the original ships left. Some of the hard metal artefacts survived all right, but the museum is still there. The day I went up to it, it was closed for repairs, and I banged the door down, and somebody let me in, and I had a very nice morning with the curator, a lovely lady who showed me around the place. And the place has a very hollow ring to it now, with just scale models of the ships. That's a replica of a wooden anchor that was found, and it laid to rest forever the argument about how these lead stocks were used on wooden Roman anchors. This is a book that was written by Guido Uccelli, the man who was in overall charge of the excavation, and La Navy, the Navy ships, and unfortunately it's never been translated into English, but it's a beautiful book, wonderfully illustrated, and I had a dreadful job finding a copy of it, and I actually read it from cover to cover using, as I practically learned Italian, using a dictionary and a digital translator. And I also had a poor man in one of the local ship shops driven mad, asking him what did this and that mean. But in actual fact, he entered into the thing with great enthusiasm, I must say. Now, another great big find was the Vasa in Sweden. It sank in 1628. This was the royal ship of King Gustavus Adolphus, Vasa of Sweden, and it was the biggest ship afloat in its time. It was meant to reflect the power and the glory of the state, and it literally only travelled, it was on its maiden voyage just after being launched, and it only travelled 1.5 kilometres during its entire lifetime. It was launched here in Skeppsholmen, and it moved around to here, and then when it came down here and altered the course to port, it heeled over, and the lower gun port being opened, the water flowed in through it, and it sank in full view of all of the onlookers. And it was rediscovered in the late 1950s, and it was taken up out of the water, whole and entire, in 1961, and put into a museum here, and subsequently moved to a new purpose-built museum there. Now, I spent a week for my 60th birthday in someone had given me a present of a ticket to go to Sweden, as it was on my bucket list for a long time, and I spent nearly a week in the Vasa Museum. Incredibly, the Swedish Navy refloated the vessel. They patched up every hole and orifice in it, and got it floating again, and got it into shallower water from where it was then patched up more and gotten into dry dock. And again, just like with the Navy ships, an army of people descended on to do the conservation work. But that's it in a restored condition. And when we were in Sweden for a week, I was down there nearly every day, and by virtue of my connection with the Maritime Museum in Dunleary, I talked my way into a situation where I was allowed to go on board. And it was a wonderful thrill, really, because most people can only view it. But you can see all there the magnificent carvings. And every scrap of timber, every match of timber that was around the vessel or near it, down in the mud of Stockholm Harbour, was recovered eventually and restored. They used a very innovative method of conserving the wood. They used a material called polyethylene glycol, which is a soluble wax with which the ship was sprayed literally for decades, gradually displacing the water, and they increased the density of the wax until it was all pure wax, and then it was switched off. The wax was allowed to solidify to the consistency of a hard candle, say. And it was cleaned off, and there it stands in all its glory, fully restored. To give you an idea of the size of the vessel by looking at the two gentlemen down here, that boat was also recovered near hand to it. It's an absolutely wonderful exhibit. But I think more importantly than the ship itself, when a ship like that sinks, it's a veritable time capsule, and there were thousands upon thousands of artefacts recovered, ordinary everyday artefacts of everyday life, carpenter's tools, like these here, which you still probably use today, medicine chests, clothing. There were a couple of bodies recovered, officers' tableware, simple wooden accoutrements, and they're all conserved and on display there, and you literally would need a week to see it all. That's a copy of a diving bell that was used shortly after the vessel sank by a man called Albrecht von Treleben, and that's a replica of it that was used at the time the vessel was refloated, to give a demonstration of how the guns were recovered, because when the vessel was recovered there were only about 3 guns left on it. All of the other big bronze guns, which would have been extremely valuable, had been recovered. By lowering this down, the air would compress in the bell, and the man in it would dodge out, attach hooks and ropes to the guns, and they would be then pulled out through the gun ports. That's another bell that was used for similar purposes by a man called Kessler around about the same period. We often wondered if this was a weight, or whether the occupant of the bell had suffered some severe physiological trauma by virtue of the pressure, and that he left his truss outside the bell. But that's the new Vasa Museum there. It's absolutely magnificent. But the point I want to make with all of these museums that I'm going to be showing you is that these become self-financing. That it cost a lot of money initially to get these set up, but they have since made money because millions of people visit these every year. Literally millions of people, and that's a kind of a notional idea of how high the masts were from where the vessel sits on the inside. A vessel that sank in similar circumstances in 50 and 45 was the Mary Rose that I mentioned earlier on, the one upon which Thomas Steele dived. There was a French fleet trying to attack Portsmouth, and Henry VIII's fleet sallied forth to face them down. They retreated and sailed back to France. But the Mary Rose was caught in a gust of wind. It heeled over, and the lower gun ports here were open, and the water just flowed in through the ports, and she sank with great loss of life and remained untouched until found by the Dean brothers, and subsequently then by Alexander McKee in the 1960s. A lot of people would remember the Mary Rose being raised, or what was left of the Mary Rose being raised in 1982, and it went on display. They used the very same method of conserving it with polyethylene glycol as had been done on the Vasa. It was a proven method, and it was sprayed like that for decades. There's only half of the ship left, but there's a great new state-of-the-art museum that's been built around the Mary Rose now. And again, if you went there to Portsmouth, in Portsmouth Naval Centre, you'd need a week to see everything there, because you have the Mary Rose Museum, you've got the Warrior, HMS Warrior just over here, great big steel, the first iron warship built in Britain. You've got the Royal Naval Museum, and you've also got Nelson's Victory just down there. So take a good week to see it all. You certainly wouldn't see all of the Mary Rose in a day. Amazingly, again, like the Vasa, there were thousands of artefacts recovered, including this case of longbows, Longbows, Now this was the standard weapon of the English during the 100 Years' War, and despite the fact that there would have literally been millions of these in existence, there wasn't a solitary one left in existence until these ones were found on the Mary Rose, and these are still capable of being fired. So I think that's an incredible thing. It was reckoned that the draw weight on those was about 120 pounds. I've seen a very strong guy that couldn't draw 60 pound bow. So these were, they reckon the archers would have been built like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and they had twisted spines. Anyway, but again, to see all of these artefacts that have been conserved and are on display, I think it's very touching, very poignant. Leather shoes look as if they've been made yesterday. Too many to go into now, but literally thousands upon thousands of artefacts. And I find that just as interesting as the ship itself. Carpenter's tools again. This is a boat that was discovered on the shores of the Sea of Galilee in 1986. It's generally referred to as the Jesus boat. And it's thought to have been, or I think it's been proved conclusively to have been about 2,000 years old. So it might more aptly be called the St. Peter boat, because it's, again, the museum has grown up around this in Israel and it's been conserved. And in a similar situation, a boat called the Kyrenia boat in northern Cyprus was discovered with all kinds of artefacts still in it, like amphorae, discovered in 1970, and that's also on display. This is practically all of these have had replicas built of them. Now, just recently, two vessels from Franklin's ill-fated expedition, or the last of his ill-fated expeditions, to try and find the Northwest Passage. Both of the vessels that had gone missing in the ice have been rediscovered, and it's thought that the Canadian government are going to try and raise these because it has solved a very, very long mystery as to what actually happened to Franklin's ships. It's sort of great. The imaging resources that they have now for the seabed are absolutely wonderful. Sonar imaging that can give you an almost photographic image. That's the bell that was recovered off HMS Erebus. There were various vessels recovered in Scandinavia. Now these weren't discovered in the sea, they were discovered on dry land. These were from burials. The Ulzberg ship, which was a royal burial, has been greatly restored, and the Gokstad ship. Again, both found in burial mounds, and there have been replicas built of these and sailed. That's a picture of the Ulzberg ship when it was found. It was reckoned to be a Viking queen. A huge amount of artifactual material found with that, including this dragon figurehead. Beautiful thing that cost a lot of money initially, but has literally cleaned its face. I had the privilege of being there for a couple of days. Absolutely wonderful. A replica was made of the Skull de Lev 2 ship, was brought to Dublin in 2007, and it was lifted in over the roof of Collins Barracks and put on display. There's myself and some of my old archaeological colleagues, we paid a visit over to it. Wonderful piece of work altogether. I can't look at anything or read anything to do with Woodquay without feeling infuriated, because when you realise what happened to that wonderful archaeological site, I literally lose it sometimes. But a great many ship timbers were found there in Woodquay, Viking ship timbers, redundant ships, the sides of the ships kept together and used as what were known as revetments. But they are sort of just like a wooden wall that was used on stakes, and the land would be filled in behind it with rocks and clay just to make a flat sort of jetty. Quite a lot of those. A lot of material written about the Viking ship timber finds in Woodquay. Now, I'll just tell you something about, I call it a quasi-archaeological expedition. This was the hunt for one of the Spanish Armada wrecks in Ireland that took place in the 1960s, in the mid-1960s. It's reckoned that there were about 26 Armada ships wrecked on the Irish coast in 1588. High winds drove them ashore, and one thing and another. But the man in the middle there, a larger-than-life character called Sidney Wignall. Now, Sidney was a self-styled archaeologist, a treasure hunter, a diver, and a mountaineer. He climbed in the Himalayas and he was arrested as a spy by the Chinese and subsequently released. As I say, a wonderful character, much larger than life sort of man. But he organised an expedition. He advertised for people to join him in searching for one of the Spanish Armada wrecks that had been wrecked in the Blasket Sound in Kerry. And he was at pains to state that it wasn't a treasure hunt, that this was an archaeological expedition. But there was a bit of tongue-in-cheek in that. But many of the people that took part in it subsequently went on to great fame in underwater archaeology. That's Colin Martin, whom you'll regularly see on television. And the man who discovered the Mary Rose, Alexander McKee, there also. The man on Sydney's right is John Grattan, who was a Royal Navy mine clearance expert. He's a direct descendant of Henry Grattan. He organised the method of searching. That's the way they marked off sections of the seabed and searched them meticulously with men strung out on a rope. And they searched for 6 months and found nothing. And they eventually found a ballast mound, no chest of treasure, no great big brass guns, just a few ordinary everyday artefacts. So certain things on what they found point to the fact that it was the Santa Maria della Rosa, including a plate that had a fellow's name on it. But there was no treasure, and there was a limited amount of archaeology done. That's a photograph from the work that they did. I think that the artefact in the foreground there, I think, was probably indicative of the standard of archaeology that was being used. But that's a very disconsolate looking Sidney Wignall there with Colin Martin and John Grattan. Sidney went off in high dudgeon. He actually had a lovely boat called the Gem Bell that he purposely sank in a fit of rage before he left Ireland, much to the chagrin of people who were with him. Well, at the same time as Sidney was looking in the Blasket Sound, there was another search for an Armada vessel going on in the far end of the country in County Antrim. This is a Belgian diver, an archaeologist called Robert Stenwy. Now, he was looking for a vessel called the Girona. The Girona was an oared galleass that had the crews of 3 different ships on board it. They put into Killybegs for repairs and were heading back around the north of Ireland to try to get to neutral Scotland when they were wrecked. They were doing okay until the wind turned northerly, and in the dark of night they were driven into this little cove here at a place called Lacada Point, near the Giant's Causeway. As you can see, it was one of these Mediterranean-style oared galleys. Now, Stenwy did extensive searches in the Spanish archives and actually found where the Girona had been wrecked. Now, there was no trace whatsoever of the ship, because in archaeological terms, this would be known as a high-energy site. That simply means that huge big waves roll in there in the winter storms. But they did find guns and subsequently found a lot of treasure. But I have to say now, Robert Stenwy had a much more archaeological approach to the excavations and to the finds than Sidney Wignall would have had, I think, because he ensured that all of these artefacts remained together, and he ultimately sold them to the Ulster Museum for quite a lot of money. It wouldn't be a lot nowadays, but it was back then. Some beautiful artefacts there, the Knight's Crosses. All of the Spanish gentry that were aboard brought all their good gear with them. They were there for the long haul. I reckon they would have been successful and would have been strutting around London perhaps wearing all of this, their finery and their gold jewellery. And that's probably the most iconic artefact found on the Girona. It's a gold salamander set with rubies, and it's on view in the Ulster Museum now. There are 2 museums which have stuff from the Armada in the north of Ireland. The Tower Museum in Derry and the Ulster Museum in Belfast. These are some of the coins that Stenwy there found that are in the gold, silver and copper coins. Some of them actually minted in Peru and places like that. Now, in 1973, there was another great Armada find in a place called Kinnigo Bay. A ship called the Trinidad Ville. It's actually on the Inishowen Peninsula. It's actually in Donegal. The ship was a transport that had been taken over by Philip of Spain and converted into a warship. It was also carrying a great deal of cargo, and it sank just about there in relatively shallow water. It limped in, it had got a hammering in the battles in the channel, and it limped in there and stayed afloat for a couple of days, and a great many of the people were taken off by the local chieftains until the vessel sank. Now the city of Derry Sub-Aqua Club used to use this place here on a Sunday morning for their training ground, to train their trainees, and they knew about the Trinidad Ville, and they were always on the lookout for that. If I could just, yeah. Popular culture said that the Trinidad Ville was down the far end of Kinnigo Bay, and I think that was based upon the information given to the English by the local chieftains to mislead them. They obviously knew where it was, so they were forever looking down there, the Derry Sub-Aqua Club, and they finally decided to dive this end of the bay, and they found a couple of bronze cannon. Now on board was, several of the guns like this. Now this is not an on-board cannon, this is a siege gun, a Spanish siege gun from a Spanish siege train. They were expert at laying siege to towns, and it would have been used perhaps to knock down the walls of fortifications on the south coast of England had the Armada been successful in landing, or perhaps batter down some of the walls of London. These fired a 50-pound ball, absolutely enormous, and there were 3 of these recovered from the Trinidad Ville. 2 of them are in the National Museum here, and 1 of them is in the Tower Museum in Derry. That gun carriage there was made by the dockyard in Chatham, based upon one of the wheels that was found on the seabed in Kinnigo Bay. I think you could safely say that size matters here. Absolutely enormous. But there's one of these guns to be seen near the foyer of the National Museum in Collins Barracks. It's only up on blocks. They don't have a gun carriage for it. There it is there, along with various other Armada guns that have been found. That's the Tower Museum in Derry, a very, very fine outfit indeed there. Lovely display, not only of the Spanish Armada stuff, I might add. But again, there's a huge amount of artefactual material found down in the sand. The City of Derry Sub-Aqua Club took a very, very responsible attitude towards this. They decided that this thing had to be done properly. They approached the Irish government and got carte blanche to do what they liked there, because you hadn't got the same interest back then that you have now. There was an arrangement made between the museum and the Ulster Museum, of the Ulster Museum to take in the artefacts and to conserve them. The Irish Museum simply hadn't got the money to do it. But over several seasons they mounted an archaeological project. Now if you want to see a film of that whole thing, it's narrated by Magnus Magnusson. You can see it online if you just put in City of Derry Trinidad Ville Archaeology or something like that, you get it. It was made by the BBC Chronicle team, and it's a wonderful account of the whole thing that they did and how they did it as a bunch of amateurs. It was greatly to their credit. I don't know where this, I have a picture of the guys who were involved with the City of Derry Sub-Aqua Club. We might come across it. But there's a Tallaght connection here now with underwater archaeology. We're coming on to the Irish bit now. The club I was involved with here was here in Tallaght, called the Marlin Sub-Aqua Club. And this is my good friend and colleague Roy Stokes, who was a wreck hunter extraordinary. He's an author and a maritime historian. And he had a great interest in historical matters and archaeological matters and in shipwrecks. Now in 1983, Roy discovered the wreck of the Queen Victoria, which was a paddle steamer, cross-channel paddle steamer that was wrecked just immediately under the Bailey Lighthouse here off Howth in 1853, the year before the Taylor was wrecked. 8 people lost. Some people managed to scramble ashore. And it lay there undisturbed until Roy found it in 1983. That's what it would have looked like. Fairly typical paddle steamer of the day. But Roy and myself were members of the Maritime Institute at the time, and the president of the Institute he had a managerial position in the Office of Public Works, and he had a great interest in maritime matters. So we managed to get a preservation order off the Office of Public Works placed on the wreck of the Queen Victoria and we got permission to carry out a survey of the wreck. Now, it was the very first of its kind in Ireland, the very first time that a wreck had been accorded any kind of protection. And it was more honoured in the breach than anything else, because as soon as word got out about it, a crowd of pirates descended upon it and started to rip it asunder and pull great lumps of bronze and copper off it and everything else. And while we were undertaking the survey even, over the space of a week, a crowd arrived in a boat and dropped their anchor, and were getting ready to dive festooned with crowbars, pickaxes even, claws and everything else. So in my best stentorian voice I ran them, and I've been getting some very funny looks of a few divers ever since. But anyway, it wasn't the end of it, because literally after a few weeks it was stripped clean. It was like as if a swarm of locusts had descended upon it. But we did achieve some results from that, and out of small acorns, great oaks grow, because it was really the beginning of archaeological diving in connection with shipwrecks in Ireland, because there was legislation being mooted at that time very strongly by the Maritime Institute and various interested bodies. But you can get an idea, we're anchored directly over the wreck there, and that's the Bailey Lighthouse in the background. You might recognise the thin young man here without the whiskers. But we carried out visual survey of it, taking measurements and see what was there, and we carried out an airlift project not to expose artefacts, but to expose somewhat more of the hull than what was visible. It was a wooden vessel, very heavily built wooden vessel. And there's Roy. We had some great fun with some people we brought out. You know those little chocolate gold coins? We brought down a few handfuls of them and put them into the air now. And great excitement altogether. We didn't actually bring up any artefacts, but we did clear away some of the sand and the seabed to see what way the hull was built. Sometimes we used the steps of the Bailey there as a base. These are just some few artefacts that were lying around. That was a lovely ornate jug, and some idiot grabbed a hold of it and broke it. But it was my brief during the whole expedition to examine the hull and to report on it, because I knew quite a good bit about wooden shipbuilding and boat building and so forth. And that was just a bronze spike from the inner planking. The outer planking was held on with great big bronze nuts and bolts, and very, very heavily built. Excuse me. 3-inch oak planking on the outside, and the inner planking was 2-inch pine. That's a bit of it there on the spike, handmade bronze spike. Again, that's yours truly. Yours truly without the whiskers. The figurehead from the Queen Victoria is in the Maritime Museum. A beautiful artefact it is. It was restored by Jim Carroll, who was in the Maritime Institute, who was a model maker. And I think a lot of the face was eroded, and I think he was rather kind to the old Queen. He actually used an old Victorian bun penny blown up to restore the features. It's a lovely artefact now, so visible. But coming into 1986, there was a pressing need felt for changes in the legislation. Because two things happened around about the same time. The Derry-na-Flan hoard here was discovered, and there was a huge procession of people back and forth through the courts trying to determine who the ownership of it and who owned it and who would be rewarded for finding it and so forth. So the legislation at the time simply didn't take account of that. In addition to that, a group of English divers came over to look for 3 Armada vessels that were wrecked off the coast of Sligo in a place called Streeda Strand. Now this old map existed showing where they were. It was fairly well known where they were, all right, but they were fairly wealthy guys who brought a couple of great big inflatable rib boats over with them, and quite a good crowd of guys. And in one swipe, going up and down the beach there, about a half a mile offshore, they discovered where the wrecks had been, and the whole seabed is littered with artefacts, bronze guns, still in the gun carriages upside down, all sorts of stuff. A 30-foot rudder off one of the ships. The 3 ships were blown in there, the Giuliana, La Levia and the Santa Maria della Visione were the names. Wonderful account of the wrecking of those in a book written by a man called Francisco de Cuellar. who got back to Spain ultimately and wrote his memoirs down. In it he regularly refers to the local savages. The local savages descended upon him and stripped him naked. And massive loss of life. But at any rate, the English guys laid claim, they called themselves the Streeter Group. They laid claim to the ships on the seabed as salvors in possession under the old Merchant Shipping Act. Now at the time, the new legislation was beginning to be passed through the Dáil, and the whole thing wound up in court, several sittings of the court, until ultimately in the High Court, a learned judge decided in favour of the state. He more or less applied the legislation in retrospect, saying that these things had passed out of the realm of commercial law and into archaeological law long before they were discovered at Strida. Some arrangement was made to recompense them with a discretionary award, but to this day nobody seems to be able to find out how much they were paid. I know a couple of the guys and they wouldn't tell me. At any rate, they're still lying, the stuff is still lying on the seabed there. Conservation, maritime conservation of artefacts that are found under the sea, it's a hugely expensive business. And the state then hadn't got the resources, and I doubt if they would have the resources today or would be willing to spend the money. But these were photographs that were taken back in 1986 when the wrecks were discovered, and that's one of those wheels again off one of the siege guns. And bronze cannon lying all over the seabed, all kinds of stuff. Over an area about 3 times the size of a football pitch, or even 4 times, I'd imagine. We did get a loan of one of the bronze guns that was recovered in the Maritime Museum through the good office of Kevin Crothers here, who was the Vice President of the Institute at the time, and we had it in a glass case full of water for a long time, until ultimately it was repossessed by the National Museum. Now, the National Monuments Amendment Act was finally passed in 1987, and the Streeter Group subsequently took the state to court, and there was more legislation ensued to try and reinforce that claim, but all attempts by them to gain possession of the wrecks failed, and they now are owned by the state. I think the state takes the view that as they've lain on the seabed for over 400 years, they will lie there a bit longer until such time as the resources become available to raise them. But it's a dreadful shame really that there's a group up in Sligo, in Grange in Sligo, who have a premises and all put by, and various artefacts have been washed ashore on the beach over the years and have been recovered and conserved, what have you, locally. And they're endeavouring to get an Armada museum built with some of the artefacts from Strida. And it's a dreadful shame that if it doesn't go ahead, there's all kinds of seminars have taken place to try and further that end. Because I know in my heart and soul that people would come from all over to visit, that it would be financially viable to do that. So around about that time, there was such a furore arose over all of the legislation and what happened to the Queen Victoria with the limited protection that was afforded at that, and how it was literally torn asunder by pirates. A great many of us who were interested in archaeology and the Maritime Institute and people from the museum decided to start up a group to try and encourage divers to become gamekeepers instead of poachers. It's called the Irish Underwater Archaeological Research Team. Now, there were no professional diving archaeologists in Ireland at the time. We were affiliated to the Nautical Archaeology Society in Britain. There's much more involvement of amateur divers with archaeological matters in Britain than there is here and than there ever was here. Now, I have to take my hat off to this young lady here. She was the first diving archaeologist in Ireland, Nessa OConnor, who was an assistant keeper in the National Museum. She became hugely interested in underwater archaeology, and she strove with might and main to encourage divers to get involved on a conservation level and on a protective level instead of being wreckies and plunderers. And she was quite successful in that, because a lot of people joined up UART, and we had, for reasons that I'll tell you, it did genuinely, to no fault of anybody, it did peter out. But I'll tell you about that in a moment. But for a long time, we assisted the authorities in the Office of Public Works and the museum in surveying wrecks and going looking at things that turned up on the shore and stuff like that. And we had some great projects. This was one that we did down in Rathcorsey near Kinsale. There were 3 different wrecks of ships that have disappeared now. They were called Kinsale hookers, a bit like a Galway hooker. And we surveyed the wrecks of those in the intertidal zone. As you can see, a very muddy affair altogether. And what we did, we actually managed to draft a set of lines for, nobody really knew what they looked like. There are several paintings of them. That was just one. It was very muddy business recording all of these things. We also sort of we gathered up information on a great many vernacular working boats that were still in existence at the time, either lying as half wrecks on beaches and in sheds and so forth. These were little working boats, and we did a huge amount of work in describing those and writing about them and photographing the remains of them and drafting the lines of them and stuff like that, because a lot of them have now disappeared. We also did what could be termed experimental archaeology with Armada down in Cork. We built a coracle and a curragh. We had great fun down in Oysterhaven rowing them about. But some of our members made major discoveries. Some of the UART members had a couple of very, very important discoveries. One of them here in Derrynane. My good friend Andrew Thoma, that you saw a picture of earlier there up at the Viking Ship, he discovered the whole seabed littered with cannon down here in Derrynane Harbour. Now, Derrynane Harbour is very near to Derrynane House, which was owned by Daniel O'Connell's uncle, Hunting Cap O'Connell. And it was known that he was quite a smuggler. And it is thought that these cannon were jettisoned from some vessel that wanted to get away in a hurry from the revenue cutter that was probably coming into view, and jettisoned the cannon so that they could get away, because there was no trace of a shipwreck or anything like that. But we did a report on that, a survey and a report on that. Another of our divers, Donald Boland, discovered a bridge down at Clonmacnoise near the monastic site. That is at the end of an old, very, very old thoroughfare on Schleemore. And he just, by a process of bit of Sherlock Holmes work, he figured that there has to have been a bridge there at some time, and he went diving there in very dark, peaty, murky circumstances, and he actually found a bridge, a great big oak bridge under the water. The centre portion of it was no longer there, but in every other respect it was fairly intact. It was a major archaeological find. We did a survey on that, but there was a much more thorough survey carried out by a professional group of archaeologists that I'll tell you about in a moment. Have to keep an eye on the time. But we did a lot of intertidal work whenever remains of vessels would appear after a big storm. This one's on Dollymount Beach. We counted 7 wrecks just came up out of the beach after a big easterly gale, and we recorded them and photographed them, and then the next tide they disappeared. They covered up again. That's another one there on Dollymount. I think that one was down in County Kerry. Incredibly, that whole wreck washed up out of the sand and wound up at the sand dunes in a recent gale. I can't remember the name of it now. But since that time, a whole lot of changes took place. The HSE was formed, and the HSE took account of diving, commercial diving, and wrote a whole lot of new criteria for that. Amateurs can't now take part in underwater archaeology alongside professionals, and you can't use scuba gear. You have to use tethered diving. You have to be tethered to the surface with an airline and a line also. So it was more or less the death knell of UART, and we had run our course, and a whole lot of divers became archaeologists, and archaeologists became divers. And these 3 people here are the linchpins of the present day professional diving unit of the Department of Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. Connie Kelleher, wonderful young woman who has done Trojan work in investigating wrecks, wonderful diver, Connie. Carl Brady also, and Fionn Moore there. All 3 of them are commercial professional divers and archaeologists. Fionn is the head of the section, and Connie and Carl do most of the diving now. There are other archaeologists involved with them who come in with them occasionally, but they're the 3. The other man on the left is Larry Dunn, who's only recently He was a land archaeologist, and he was the man who actually excavated Kevin Barry's body when it was recovered from the jail. But he's now heavily involved in underwater archaeology. I mentioned imagery. New sophisticated imaging devices that are used for, sonar, give you a very clear view of what's on the bottom, almost photographic view. And there was a survey being done in Loch Corrib recently with a view to mapping the lake. And the man who was doing it discovered a great many of these wooden log boats on the bottom of the lake. Carl Brady investigated many of them. He gave a wonderful talk about that to the Royal Society of Antiquaries. And he found some amazing discoveries in them. He actually found Viking axe heads in that one there on the top, and a Viking spear. It's generally reckoned that they were left in position. In some instances, small samples were taken from them for dendrochronology. That's tree-ring dating. And it's thought that some of them are thousands of years old, a couple of thousand years old, whilst others belong to the 15 or 1600s even. That's another man who's involved heavily there in underwater archaeology, a contract archaeologist, Dr. Neil Brady. This was at a seminar in the Dublin port, excuse me, on the archaeology and the history of the built heritage of the port. You all know Duncan, Neil Brady, Rob Goodbody, and yours truly. Connie Kelleher is presently doing work on a wreck that was found just over here on Rutland Island. Oh, that's Arranmore Island there. This is near Burton Port in Donegal. A wreck was discovered there, and Connie's investigating it and excavating it. It's thought to be of the Armada period. That it might well be one of the small transports, not a warship, a transport that was associated with the Armada that got blown in there and simply sank, having been damaged. But that's Connie working away with her airlift on some of that wreck, and she's discovered some very interesting artefacts there. These are bricks from the galley. All of the cooking would have been done on a brick stove with wood, charcoal, what have you. A small little beaker, I forget now, there's a particular name on that and I can't think of what it is. In Strida that I mentioned just a moment ago, after a very big gale, some artefacts were washed up on the beach. So it was decided then that we should lift some of the artefacts. Now, not all of them. So they lifted some of the more vulnerable ones, the ones that were very visible on the surface. The Archaeological Diving Unit went out in that vessel there, and they lifted a few of the guns. That's a great big cauldron for cooking in, and that's another one of those siege gun wheels. On the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, it was decided to lift the anchors from the Odd, the vessel that was bringing in all of the guns and ammunition for Roger Casement to the rebels in 1916, and was sunk in Cork Harbour, scuttled by the German captain. So they decided to lift the anchors and make a monument of them after due conservation work was carried out. Huge amount of ammunition lying on the seabed there, millions of rounds. Those are all machine gun and rifle bullets there. Some of the pieces of the rifles, what have you, scattered around the seabed also. When there was a pipeline being built from Sutton over to Ringsend to take the new sewage works, bring all the sewage from the north side to be processed over at Ringsend, a trench was cut across Dublin Bay. That's Larry Dunn, who I mentioned there. He was the archaeologist in charge, but I was outraged at this, really. They went in a straight line, and despite having done a pre-disturbance survey, a sub-bottom survey, they went through 13 historic shipwreck sites, including probably at least one or two Viking vessel sites. As I saw, Larry asked me to look at the timbers that are in. They were in great big tanks, half the size of the room here, shallow tanks of water over in Baldoyle, and I had a look at them, and I positively identified some of them as being of Viking period, because I'd seen all of the stuff from Wood Quay. So I dissociated myself from that, and I wrote some very snotty letters to the Department of Heritage and the curator of the National Museum about that, because they were in open defiance of their own legislation governing shipwrecks. You're not allowed, if I was to do something like that, I'd wind up in jail. So what did they do? Now I don't know whether it was on foot in my letter or not, but they went and passed legislation shortly afterwards which allows them to do that. A further amendment to the National Monuments Act. They can now drive a motorway through Tara if they want to, if it's in the national interest. So that's the line that it took there. But Dublin Bay, like that, was always a very dangerous place, and it's literally paved with shipwrecks underneath the sand. One of the most recent finds was up in Drogheda. This is the Drogheda boat. It was found on the bank of the Boyne, just above Drogheda, in an almost intact condition, a clinker-built vessel that is almost pure Viking. It's from a slightly later period than the Viking, but it has all of the elements of Viking ships with regard to the material used, the methods of construction, and so forth, except for one thing, that it has a rudder. Viking ships didn't have a rudder, they had a steering oar, and that's what it would have looked like, slightly bigger than that. And it was actually a small merchant ship. This is Holger Schweitzer, the archaeologist in charge of that. He invited us up to have a look at the stuff, and it was taken up, put into tanks in a warehouse and dropped on the quay, and it's soaking there, awaiting conservation or whatever. So we had to go to that, about the size of it there, marked out. You see those tanks where all the material is lying in there, just simply in water. So we had a good look at it, and it was easy to determine what period it was from. It was the immediate post-Viking period. But it was very, very interesting because there were a load of barrels, the pieces of barrels found in this wreck. It was more or less embedded in the bank of the river, and there were fish bones found in the barrels, in where the barrels had been, that were identified as herring bones. There were also marks on the barrel heads, and they were able to identify the vineyards which had supplied those barrels. So it was obviously a vessel that was bringing salt herrings back to France in the barrels, and then bringing wine up from France up to Drogheda. Now, I don't know what's going to become of that, because it's crying out to be reassembled, because it's virtually intact. All of the pieces are there, and it would be very, very easy to replicate anything that would be missing. That's part of the bow of the vessel there, and it's exactly the same way that Viking ship bows are built. That's Darina Tully, another archaeological friend of mine, who did a huge amount of work in these small vernacular boats that I was telling you about in investigating those. She travelled all over the country researching those. You see the pieces there that belong to the shape of the bottom on the inside. That's a machine that's been used by Holger to give a three-dimensional picture of the vessel. At least we know what it looked like. It was never reassembled. Fascinating piece of equipment. But that's just a wreck chart, a Board of Trade wreck chart. We're nearly finished now. A Board of Trade wreck chart for what's the date on it there? 1868, I think. There was one of these published every year by the Board of Trade. And look at all the little black dots on those. See clusters of black dots. That represents the amount of shipwrecks in any one particular year. You see huge clusters of them around London, all the big British ports, even Belfast, and the southern approaches here. So there's a huge amount of stuff there on the seabed, and with all of the great new technology that's going around nowadays, I think. Now, this is the sort of imagery that you would expect to see with this new sophisticated stuff. It gives you a three-dimensional view. That's the Lusitania down off Cork, what it looks like, a total wreck. These are three ships adjacent to Dublin Bay. The Guide Me To is a World War I drifter that sank in a collision. The WM Barclay was torpedoed. That was the first ship owned by Guinnesses, and that's the Leinster, about which you've probably heard an awful lot lately. Carl Brady, whom I mentioned, and Ian Lawler, good friend of mine, and Charlize McKeown from there's a crowd going around doing that sort of surveying on behalf of the Department of the Marine, mapping the seabed, and they're making tremendous discoveries. Two wonderful books have been written about that, in which Carl Brady was involved. The Shipwreck Inventory of Ireland, which takes only account of the east coast. This saw practically all of the shipwrecks that are known about. So it's only volume one of several. And that other one there is a very fine work also. This is the last slide. Diving has come on in leaps and bounds since I first did it. This is my good friend Stewie Andrews. And these guys are diving using that looks like a conventional aqualung, but it's not. That's called a rebreather. They're using mixed gases, using helium and computerized technology that recycles the gas inside, gets rid of all the carbon dioxide out. And they're diving to depths that are utterly unthinkable, or would have been utterly unthinkable in my day. When we dived to 40 metres, or when we contemplated diving to 40 metres, we did so in awe. But these guys are diving to 150 and so forth. So they're making tremendous discoveries. But it wouldn't be for me. But they're certainly taking great photographs. So it's a big subject. I could go on and on and on and on. But there we will leave it. And thank you for your attention.
Any questions, folks?
What's the name of the museum
Did you know it was by
in Sweden that you're talking about?
It's just called the Vasa Museum.
And which town, which city is it?
It's very near the centre of Stockholm. It's just
Stockholm.
walking distance. Or the Stockholm harbour is a whole lot of little islands, and there's a wonderful ferry service all the way around it. So no matter what part of the archipelago you'll be in, you'll be able to get a ferry to it, and you couldn't miss it. You can see the great mast sticking up there. There's another very interesting vessel very near it called the Aft Chapman. It was a great big steel square rigger that was owned by T&C Martin's firm, cargo carrying vessel around the turn of the century, and it was then called the Dunboyne. It's now a floating hostel. It's one of the very few great big steel square riggers of the period that still survives.
You brought back fabulous memories of the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau.
Indeed, yeah.
On RT, I think on a Sunday,
Yeah.
might have been on
I
Sunday.
cast my mind back to when that started off. I watched all of those in black and white.
Yeah.
And I've subsequently looked at them in colour, and they've lost nothing. They're very, I'll have to say now, Cousteau, if you look at some of the very early Cousteau, like all the rest of us, at the time was on a learning curve with regard to environmental matters and with regard to archaeological matters, because it was all in its infancy. He did things in his early programmes that would have been unthinkable to him when he became a great conservationist in his later years, like knocking great lumps of coral with lump hammers, blowing up sections of the reef to take samples.
Well, in the 1980s, I got a call to go to a bit of a ruckus that took place in the house in the early hours of the morning. And there's a lady there who was a model in her day in the 1960s of a Twiggy kind of vintage, who had become a sculptor in the meantime. And I think she fashioned the little monument to the Gorta monument that used to be on North Earl Street or Collins Street area. Anyway, who they meet inside in this little bit of a schmozzle that was gone in the house? Only herself, a little miniature of the sculpture from North Earl Street, and two of the brothers that used to dive for Jacques Cousteau.
Really? Oh, wow.
So one of them had a party piece, and his party piece will remain with me forever. He got a walnut, placed it between the cheeks of his backside, his buttocks, and he cracked the walnut open. Needless to say, there wasn't too many people lining up to eat the walnut.
Actually, Jacques Cousteau told me that he had one of his grandmothers was Irish. She was an O'Moore.
But wasn't it a fabulous achievement that chap had? A fabulous party trick, cracking walnuts between the cheeks and the backside.
Must try that sometime.
Incredibly strong men, it struck me that they were.
Yeah. They've all passed away. There's none of the original team left of Cousteau's. Very well. Sorry, wait, go ahead.
The chap, I forget his name at the moment, who wrote Seascapes.
The door, sorry. I beg your pardon, sorry.
The chap who wrote Seascapes, he was on RTE for 16 or 18 years. He wrote it in 2004 or 5. He reckons at that time that the Irish government totally disregarded the sea in all its aspects.
Oh, absolutely, I couldn't agree more, yeah.
Shipping and all the rest.
Yeah, I used to have with Tom McSweeney.
Yeah, I couldn't remember the name.
Believe me, Tom's heart is in the right place, and he should be listened to by a lot of the people in power. Now, I read a very large file.
He's still broadcasting.
Oh yeah, he's down in Cork on a lot of local Cork stations. I did an interview for him recently about something, I can't remember what it was. Yeah. But I read a very large file of letters that had gone back and forth between Sidney Wignall's group the Santa Maria della Rosa in the Blasket Sound group. An old friend of mine that was working with them, Desi Brannigan and Sidney Whelan and the Irish government. Brannigan was more or less their agent here, and he was writing to the Irish government to get permission of them to excavate these wrecks. And if you read the replies, they said they had nothing to do with them whatsoever. They had no involvement whatsoever. Go and see the Spanish government. Absolutely amazing how much of a sea change you've gotten since then. You know, if you touch anything underwater now, you get your collar felt, and rightfully so, I think.
I think that was an absolutely fabulous lecture, Cormac. I'm wrecked from receiving all that information.
Good.
And absolutely wonderful. Once again, Cormac Loud, folks. That's our next occasion. In the meantime, folks, I'd like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a very Happy New Year. God bless to all of you. Safe home.
I don't want to preempt the lecture or anything, but he was responsible for opening St. Patrick's Institution, was the first mental hospital in these islands. He said, and his epitaph was, he gave what little wealth he had to make a home for fools and mad, and proved by one satiric touch no nation needed it so much.